So today we are going to be talking about another ancient civilization, and this is one of the early ones, and that is Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia, the word Mesopotamia actually means the land between two rivers in Greek, which makes a lot of sense because Mesopotamia was the ancient region that was between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, right? So it's literally the land between two rivers, being the Tigris and Euphrates. And it was in the Middle East, what is modern day Turkey and Iraq, right? So in between the rivers, and it was made up of many different tribes and peoples and languages and cities and empires. So it has a really unique history that's quite different from some of the other ancient civilizations that we have explored, like ancient China or ancient Greece or ancient Rome. They're a little bit different. The land in Mesopotamia was very fertile with rich soil, there was a warm climate, there was reliable rainfall. This made it a really great place to have crops and farms. And because of that, when people were first settling there, they grew crops. Mesopotamia initially was mostly just farms, right? It was such a great place for crops with the rain and the rich soil. It made a perfect place for farmland. Not everywhere is farmland, of course, but that was a huge part of Mesopotamia. Eventually, these farms would develop into villages. So within Mesopotamia, there were different empires and civilizations in the Mesopotamian land. So the first one was Sumer. Like I said, this was the first of Mesopotamia. They invented writing, they invented a form of government, and they had city-states. These were different cities that had their own little sorts of government that sometimes would work together, sometimes not. After the Sumerians were the Akkadians, and they had the first united empire. So in Sumer, there were city-states, but the Akkadians actually brought these city-states together. So how we think about now in the United States, all of the states work under the federal government. The Akkadians actually had quite a similar structure, a really early structure, so it's not exactly the same, but similar. After the Akkadians were the Babylonians. Now, Babylon was very powerful, arguably one of the most powerful empires within Mesopotamia. It did have actually quite a few rises and falls, which means sometimes it had a lot of power and sometimes it fell to the defeat and conquering of other civilizations and other people, but nonetheless had a very powerful effect. They were the first to actually write down and record a law system. Now, this isn't to say that they were first to have a law system, but they were the first to write it down and give details. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next. After the Babylonians were the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians were very much a warrior society. There was a lot of interfighting between the city-states. And what we know about the Assyrians comes from different characters that were written on clay tablets. So like now we have books or the internet to learn things about history. The way that they wrote down things that were happening were on clay tablets. And then finally, the Persians. Now, the Persians ended the rule of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and eventually conquered Mesopotamia. And so that was pretty much the end of the era of Mesopotamia, or what we think of as Mesopotamia. So let's just talk briefly about two of those civilizations that I think had some really important inventions and innovations to culture and things that you should know. So the first is Sumer. Now, as I said, this was the first civilization within Mesopotamia. We believe it was first formed in or around 5000 BC. It was initially nomads who were coming to this land between the two rivers, and they realized that it was such a fertile and rich land with lots of great places for growing crops. So it turned into farmland and then formed into small villages. And sometimes people refer to this as the cradle of civilization. When we think of the word cradle, you probably think of babies, right? And babies are the beginning of life. After these small villages were formed, eventually these would then turn into or develop into city-states. So more what we think of cities now. These cities did fight a lot with each other, though. They were not always at peace or united. One important thing that first started in Sumer but was very prevalent throughout all of Mesopotamian history were the ziggurats. Now, if you've ever seen a pyramid, a ziggurat is actually not that different from. It does look a little bit like a pyramid, but it has steps and levels to it that are more clear. These stepped pyramids were places of worship for Sumerians and just Mesopotamians as a whole, for them to worship their gods, and they actually believed that the god spirits slept in these ziggurats, and the very first one was built in Ur. Okay, next we're just going to talk a little bit about Babylon. Now, Babylon has actually a really interesting history, but it was the first of these civilizations to form a true empire that encompassed Mesopotamia. So initially with the Akkadians and the Sumerians, though they did have a form of control, it wasn't over the whole area of Mesopotamia. There were other smaller groups of people and tribes, so there wasn't one unified sense of control like Babylon had. And this is the reason why Babylon is known to have had so much power within Mesopotamia. In 1792 BC, King Hammurabi made his code, Hammurabi's Code. And as I said before, Babylonians were the first to write down and record their legal system. Hammurabi's Code is that legal system. It had 282 laws, and it was written on clay tablets and pillars, and these gave laws on anything from marriage to kids. Very powerful. Another interesting feature about Babylon is that it had hanging gardens. If we think of gardens, you probably think of on the ground, there's a bed of soil and there's plants coming out, but actually in Babylon, a lot of their buildings did have plants hanging out the side, so they weren't really so much in the ground, but a part of the building's architecture hanging off of the sides. Very nice looking. We're just going to go over some daily life of Mesopotamia that did hold pretty true throughout the changes in civilization and rulers. One part of daily life in Mesopotamia was the class system. Now, a class system is a system of the community, of the people, where who you are born to, your job, where you live, determines the status that you have. So in Mesopotamia, the king and his family were considered at the top of the class system. Next were the priests, then the higher administration and scribes, then craftsmen and merchants and people who worked in the city-states, then laborers and farmers, and at the bottom of the caste system, who were valued the least, were slaves. Another part of daily life is their homes. Now, their homes are quite different than some other early ancient civilizations. They actually had homes made of mud and brick, and they were rectangular, usually with 2 or 3 floors, and they had great ventilation. They were very cool because of the mud in the warmer months, but because of the mud, it actually created great insulation in colder weather. Entertainment was actually a really huge part of Mesopotamian culture, and some of the earliest forms of entertainment that we still use today come from them. They had many festivals that also included boxing and wrestling. There were lots of toys for young people to play with. Art and poetry were a huge part of their entertainment. And finally, clothing. So mostly people in ancient Mesopotamia wore clothes made of sheepskin and wool, things that would keep them cooler in the warmer months and warmer in the cooler months. Both men and women had long hair, often braided, and they often had piercings, and also both men and women wore makeup. Not the makeup that we would maybe wear and sell today, but the makeup that they wore then was normal for everyone to wear. Here is a quick quiz to test and see what you have learned about Mesopotamia.